Hi, and thank you for tuning into the Nature Conversations podcast. I'm Dr Adam Forbes. I'm a forest ecologist who specialises in the restoration of New Zealand's forest ecosystems. This podcast isn't about me, however. The purpose of the Nature Conversations podcast is to capture knowledge and insights from remarkable people and to profile important issues for ecology and nature conservation. Today I'm very fortunate to have Dr Karen Holl, a global leader in forest restoration, join me on the podcast.
In 2019, a big paper came out in Science, this big journal, sort of saying with these maps of, we're going to plant 1 trillion trees and we're going to plant our way out of climate change. And so we were like, we have to write this paper now. So we did. So in 2020, we wrote a paper. It's called Tree Planting is Not a Simple Solution. And we sort of pointed out the good things and also the potential problems with tree planting. And since that time, in the last 4 years, this has consumed a large portion of my life. First priority is protecting existing forests, then go in and restore or plant trees. If we protect existing forests, they have the carbon, they have the biodiversity, they have it now.
Karen Holl is a professor of environmental studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research focuses on understanding how local and landscape scale processes affect ecosystem recovery from human disturbance and using this information to restore damaged ecosystems. She studies restoration of rainforest in Latin America and chaparral, grassland and riparian systems in California. She oversees a long-term tropical forest restoration study in southern Costa Rica and has worked with students and collaborators in Mexico, Brazil, Colombia and Panama. She advises numerous land management and conservation organizations in California and internationally on ecological restoration efforts. In recent years, she has advised multiple non-profit and business groups on improving outcomes of tree growing projects. She has published over 150 scientific articles and is the author of Primer of Ecological Restoration, published in 2020 by Island Press. She was the 2017 co-winner of the Theodore Sperry Award of the Society for Ecological Restoration, was elected as a Fellow of the California Academy of Sciences and the Ecological Society of America. She is the holder of the University of California MacArthur Foundation Chair for Climate Solutions. She teaches courses in restoration ecology, conservation biology, and interdisciplinary environmental research methods. Well, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Karen Holl to the Nature Conversations podcast. Dr. Holl, welcome, and I thank you for taking the time to join me.
Thanks for having me here today.
Would you like to start just by telling us a little bit about yourself in terms of your professional interests and some of the main areas you've been working in?
Sure. So I'm a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I've been for 28 years, and I'm a restoration ecologist. I have a book out of my primer of ecological restoration, which is now available in also in Portuguese, Spanish, and soon to be Chinese and Farsi. And I do work on how to, as an ecologist, how to restore damaged ecosystems. And I have worked a lot. I'm best known for my work in tropical forests, but I've also worked in temperate forests, and I work a lot in grasslands near California. And I do work on the ecological side of restoration. That said, and it'll probably come up in our subsequent questions, a lot of obstacles to restoration are more social. And so I do also work some in that area, but I am trained and focused primarily on understanding how ecosystems work and then trying to design restoration strategies to restore ecosystems.
Very good, thank you. What is it that led you into a career focused on the science of forest restoration? Is there anything in particular that led you down that path, do you think?
Well, it's sort of a long story, but I originally was going to go to vet school. I started out in biology, and the humorous part of that story is that I decided not to stay and to do that, partly because I thought I didn't want to be like in school the rest of my life. And what have I ended up doing? I've ended up in a career totally in academia, but I'm glad that I did change. And I ended up in restoration. First of all, I'm interested in the ecology side of things because I'm really fascinated by how living systems work. I took a course, but I decided to go more the applied ecology route. And I took a course in between my second and third year of college about restoration ecology. And that was really before it was much of a field, and got really excited about that. And that's how I originally got started. I actually did my PhD work studying coal surface mine reclamation in the eastern United States, and then was asked by some of my professors that I worked with as an undergraduate if I wanted to think about doing some work in tropical forest for a postdoc. And I wrote a grant proposal, and it was funded, and I started working on tropical forest restoration, even though I really had very little experience in tropical forests, but I stuck it out and learned a lot, and then have spent much of the rest of my career in tropical forests, particularly in Latin America. But like I said, I also work in California too, where I live.
Is there a particular country in Latin America that you've done a lot of your work in?
My long-term project, I started working in Costa Rica, and the long-term project I have now, which is over 20 years old, has been in Costa Rica. That said, I have worked with students and collaborators in Mexico, Panama, Colombia, and quite a bit in different areas of Brazil. And while my own primary projects in Costa Rica, I do feel like I've made a conscious decision in the last 15 years or so, if I'm going to work in tropical countries in Latin America, that I really should be collaborating with scientists in those countries. And that's a better role for me to be playing. Otherwise, it gets pretty complicated as to my role as somebody from a high income country coming in and telling people what to do. And I think it's a much better role for me to be working in an advisory role with scientists that work in those countries, helping to advise, and also but they have a lot better sense of the ecology and the political system. And they also have, my collaborators tend to be more based in those countries where they're in a much better situation to actually implement any results of the work. And so I've advised in other countries worldwide, but really feel most comfortable and had the most experience in Latin America.
Yeah, right. So does that mean that you have tend to have taken on students from those countries as well, or are they mainly students from North America?
A mix of both. The work in Panama, Mexico, Colombia, in those cases, I had students who were from Latin America who were working in those. And right now I collaborate a lot and advise students who work with my primary collaborator in Brazil, Pedro Brancaleon. And so we're actually about to advise a student who's actually a dual citizen of the United States and Brazil. So that's a good fit. But I've also advised a number of his Brazilian students, like it's not the primary advisor. So it's a mix. And then I've had in Costa Rica, my own PhD students have mostly been from the United States. One of my current ones actually grew up in Costa Rica. He's also a dual citizen of the two, or he's grew up in Costa Rica, but is a US citizen. So a little bit of both.
Oh, very good. Well, thanks for explaining that. So long-term restoration experiments, I understand that you have some pretty unique experiments in terms of their duration. I'd love to hear a bit more about those. Are they to do with restoration of agricultural lands? Would you like to just explain a little bit about that work that you've been doing for such a long time?
So my project in Costa Rica, which I was co-directed by my collaborator, is named Zach Zahawi. He's actually right now the director of the Charles Darwin Foundation in Ecuador, in the Galapagos Islands, but he did live in Costa Rica for about 10 years. And so this project we started 20 years ago, and the idea, there was two questions we were trying to ask. The first question was trying to test this idea of what we called applied nucleation, which is where you plant patches of trees rather than planting the whole area of trees. And the idea with this, and more recently I've worked with this with my colleague Pedro Brancaleon in Brazil, is rather than where we're also testing planting strips of trees, but is rather than planting a whole, let me step back. We know that forests tend to recover naturally, patchily. And so if you go out to like an old field, and in many countries, I think where it was forested, you tend to see like patches of trees, and then those over time tend to grow and coalesce. So the question was, one of the ways to do forest restoration is allow the forest to regenerate naturally. And that works in some cases, but it has to be usually a system where it's pretty resilient, where there's nearby sources of flora and fauna to colonize, where it hasn't been used too intensively. What's most often used for restoration is to actually go out and plant trees, but that can also result in pretty homogeneous ecosystems. So our idea was that if we know how systems naturally recover patchily, maybe we should be planting the trees in patches. In tropical forests, a lot of the species, somewhere between like 75 and 80% of the tree species are dispersed by animals. So by planting patches, you're attracting the seed dispersers, usually bats and birds. You're also shading out some of the aggressive pasture grasses that outcompete young seedlings. And so over time to see if those spread. So what we did was we went out 20 years ago and we planted at the time about 16 sites, where at each site we had a quarter hectare plot where we put no planting the entire area with a limited number of tree species, but to establish a canopy, and then planting in these patches, or we call them islands of trees, which are either 4 by 4 meters, 8 by 8, or 12 by 12 meters. So that was comparing those strategies. The other thing that we were looking at is some of our plots. We replicated this a lot across a lot of sites, because when you do restoration, oftentimes the results are at different sites. And so if you really want to recommend a strategy, you need to have done it at multiple sites. So we did it at a lot of sites. We also had those sites along a forest cover gradient. So we were also looking at, like, how important is it to have a lot of forest cover nearby. So what we found from that study is that it does seem that for the most part, planting the trees does increase recovery, but in most variables that we measure, like plants, insects, various seed dispersal, that planting the tree islands actually works almost as well as planting the whole area with trees. We find similar number of tree recruits of most groups. Birds seem to like more tree cover, so a little bit higher with the birds in the fully planted area. But for the most part, we find that planting these tree islands is actually a pretty good strategy. From an ecological standpoint, it creates a more heterogeneous canopy cover. And we do find that the islands spread over, the nuclei islands spread over time, and then they cover the area. So we think it's actually, from an ecological standpoint, a really practical way to do it. And it, of course, requires less resources because you don't have to plant the whole area. That said, we have discovered there are some social obstacles or logistical obstacles to planting. People are used to planting in line, so it's a little bit like having to plant patches is not quite, it's a little more challenging. But the biggest issue is that landowners in Costa Rica, what we've discovered is that as ecologists, we think using natural regeneration and planting these patches of trees is great because it creates what we call heterogeneity. On the flip side, landowners think it looks messy. And so, I mean, I'm sort of grossly categorizing here, but particularly on small land holdings, it seems like it may make more sense to just plant the trees, a lot of trees. This might be a better strategy, like in a national park where you have a big area you're trying to restore with limited resources, where you don't have people saying, oh, it doesn't look that landscaped on my land, or, you're not using it for production. So that's what we found from the study. We've also found that, as far as having a nearby source of propagules of plants and animals, seeds and animals that can colonize, that it's not as much forest cover that's important, but specific seed sources in the landscape. And sometimes there'll be remnant trees out in the pastures that can be seed sources. Sometimes, sometimes they're coming from the remnant forest, but it really, you have to look on a species by species basis and say, okay, where are the nearest seed sources? And sort of thinking about, which ones are going to colonize. So anyways, it has been 20 years, and now we're really starting. What's really neat about this project, so we don't have 16 sites anymore. At this point, we have about 11, but we're still pretty proud of the fact that we have the longest running, well-replicated restoration project, where we have multiple different strategies tested. So now we can start looking at how the forests recover, do the later, the more sort of, we call them later successional species, the ones that don't come in right off the bat. Are those starting to colonize? Are we getting the full complement of bird species, things like that? I mean, and so things are getting closer, but we're still not, after 20 years, which isn't surprising. It takes forests a while to recover. They're still not fully recovered, but we are getting a lot of species back.
That is so fascinating. Thank you for explaining all of that. That empirical data is just so important, isn't it? To see over time things develop. What you've set up there is a very valuable thing, I can tell. It's great. On your lab, I was reading about your lab, your research lab, and one of the components that I can see there's been work on is regarding tree planting campaigns. And, I'm aware of different campaigns around the world. We've had one in New Zealand called the 1 Billion Tree campaign. And I'm just really interested to hear from you, what your lab is working on around these campaigns and what you might be finding or where the work might be going.
So I've been working on forest restoration for a long time. I work a lot with my colleague currently in Brazil. I'm working with my colleague here, Pedro Brancaleone. He does a lot of large scale forest restoration in Brazil. And we in 2017 have been talking about the fact that there was a lot of interest picking up on tree planting. And we didn't think people were very realistic about like what you can and can't achieve with tree planting. So there's a lot of benefits of tree planting, but there's also a lot of potential negative effects. And so you can, obviously there's the potential to have carbon, to have biodiversity, for people possibly have income, but also if you plant trees in the wrong places, you can destroy native habitats. If you plant a lot of trees into arid systems, native habitats like grasslands and shrublands that didn't necessarily have trees. You can also have situations where you plant into arid systems where you actually reduce the water supply because the trees use so much water. There's also places where they planted into agricultural lands, and then people were using those agricultural lands, so they go clear forests elsewhere. So we were noticing like this, there's a little bit of just this sort of, I don't know, tree planting hysteria about, and we were saying, oh, we really need to write this paper sort of saying what you can and can't achieve with tree planting. Well, we're busy people. We didn't write this paper. And then in 2019, a big paper came out in Science, this is a big journal, sort of saying with these maps of, oh, we're gonna plant 1 trillion trees and we're gonna plant our way out of climate change. And so we were like, we have to write this paper now. So we did. So in 2020, we wrote a paper. It's called Tree Planting is Not a Simple Solution. And we sort of pointed out the good things and also the potential problems with tree planting. And since that time, in the last 4 years, this has consumed a large portion of my life because there's a huge amount of funding and interest. As you said, the New Zealand 1 billion tree campaign. And I should say, I've never been to New Zealand. However, I did review a paper that critiques that whole project. So I have some familiarity. And I would say that the issues that have come up there are the same issues that come up worldwide. And so we started as a result of this paper. So then our next step was we've also talked about, so I get called by a lot of reporters. I've talked to, the Wall Street Journal, I've talked to the New York Times, I've talked to the Guardian, a lot of different groups. I also get asked to advise a lot of groups that are doing reforestation. And there's sort of 3 main messages I have. Message number 1 is we are not going to plant our way out of climate change. It's one piece of the puzzle, but there's no way we can plant enough area given other land uses. And so we absolutely have to be reducing our greenhouse gas emissions quickly. So it's definitely one part, but we need to be using every possible strategy to bring our greenhouse gas emissions into balance. The other problem is that you take geologic carbon that's been stored for millions of years, you put that into trees, and trees are not permanent. People can cut them down. In the Western United States, we see that, fires break out, there's insect outbreaks, there's all these different reasons that, they can die. So we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Second of all, first priority is protecting existing forests, then go in and restore or plant trees. If we protect existing forests, they have the carbon, they have the biodiversity, they have it now. We really need to focus on that. And so, in Brazil, there's great stuff going on in the Atlantic forest restoration, but we really need to be doing first priority is protecting the Amazon. Same thing in the United States. Donald Trump would say, oh, yes, let's plant trees. But at the same time, he was wanted to allow logging in the Tongass temperate rainforest, which is sort of like, I'm sure you have temperate rainforests in New Zealand, stores a lot of carbon. Not necessarily in the case of Alaskan forests are they super diverse, but they're huge carbon, store a lot of carbon. And so we really need to be protecting the existing forest first. And third, if we are going to be planting trees, we need to be doing it right. And I like to call it tree growing, not tree planting. And the reason for that is because, first of all, just because you plant a tree, it doesn't grow. You can plant a lot of trees, they can die, and most of these initiatives, and I think the 1 billion tree campaign in New Zealand is the same, it's how many trees we've planted. Well, what we really care about is how many of these trees are alive in 20 years or 40 years or however long it is afterwards. And so that's really what our target should be. We need to grow them. The second reason is that you don't necessarily need to plant a tree to grow a tree. There's a lot of trees that regenerate naturally, and it depends on the ecosystem, but you can see in like areas, a lot of areas, they regenerate really quickly. In California, following our fires, a lot of like the redwoods where I live have resprouted. And so we don't always have to go out and plant. And the most cost-effective way is to start by saying, which species come back on their own. So that's kind of been my message. Since that time, we've done a lot more work in my lab. After getting asked these questions so many times of like, how do we do it better and which group should we support? My colleague Pedro and I wrote a paper in 2022 where we laid out a whole set of criteria of how we can improve tree growing. It boils down to a few things: engaging local communities, making sure that they feel benefits and they're committed over the long term. It means thinking about what your goals of the project are and making sure that however you're going about doing restoration makes sense. We can get carbon and biodiversity in the same system, but you can also get carbon without having biodiversity. And again, there's been, I know, critiques of the New Zealand billion tree planting campaign because people are planting like just Pinus radiata. And so trying to, think about those and also really being in it for the long term. And so, not just do we just plant, but how do we make sure those trees survive? And so we wrote this paper, and then more recently my lab has been looking at how well these tree growing organizations are actually following these guidelines. And the answer there is that they're giving an increasing amount of recognition to these needs to do it better. We still have a long way to go about like really making long-term funding commitments, having good monitoring. I mean, people are still like, most groups don't monitor, or they monitor for 1 to 5 years, and that's not long enough. And so that's kind of what we've been looking at. And like I said, I am like, my main knowledge about the New Zealand campaign is about reading about it, but I would say that a number of the critiques that I've seen, like, needing to protect forests first, needing to include both biodiversity and carbon goals, looking at, really supporting landowners long term, it's the same things that are being discussed there, and that's their global issues. I mean, the dynamics are a little bit different when you're in somewhere like New Zealand and the United States, where there is more funding and the funding is coming from where you're planting. It becomes even more complicated when you have a high income country paying groups in low and middle income countries to do reforestation. Then there's even more issues involved of just like the power struggle and what you're asking people to do, and people needing to live off the income from their land. But a lot of the same issues come up globally about large tree planting campaigns.
Well, thank you so much.
That's a pretty long answer, but that's
fabulous. Very good. Look, I'm interested in your view of what's important for forests in the face of ongoing climate and biodiversity crises. I appreciate you've probably already covered some of that, but I've always thought that forest restoration has to be one of the most important aspects of addressing these crises. It has to be pretty central. And I'm just interested in what your thoughts are on where the work and emphasis needs to lay in order for us to see a brighter future for the state of our forests.
Well, as I said, I did talk a little bit about this here, is that people want to solve a lot of problems through tree planting. And there's a lot of different reasons people plant trees. They plant trees for carbon, for biodiversity, for water quality improvement, in urban areas, for shade and green spaces, for agroforestry, for timber. There's all of these different reasons. They're all valuable. But we really have to be clear that, first of all, it's important to decide what's the first priority and what are other priorities, because we can achieve multiple goals, but we don't necessarily achieve multiple goals. And so actually just earlier today I gave a talk here in Brazil, and an example in Brazil is that there's tons of eucalyptus planted. Eucalyptus sequester carbon quite well. But if you're looking for biodiversity, that's not what you want to be planting. They're also a super important, one of the reasons they're planted so much is because of, Brazil is the largest paper pulp producer. So, if you're looking for like, it's not really great timber, but, lightweight timber and also paper pulp, then yeah, plant eucalyptus, but you're not going to get biodiversity. And so there are trade-offs, and that's really important. I mean, another trade-off is, agroforestry systems. We can definitely store some carbon in agroforestry systems, but you can't store as much as if you were restoring to forests. And so you're balancing there. So it's important to be thinking about, particularly, I mean, you asked about sort of climate mitigation and biodiversity. We absolutely can plant diverse forests or grow diverse forests that have both carbon and biodiversity, but those have to be an explicit goal of the project. And it probably costs more than just doing carbon alone. And so one of the problems is you get these like ads that pop up on your computer that say, for $1, you can plant a tree. But my line is for $1, you might be able to plant a tree, but you can't really grow a tree. It takes a lot, more money. It also depends on where you're doing this work too. But a lot of these groups are trying to find like the cheapest carbon possible. And if you're trying to find the cheapest carbon, then the default is you're probably not going to get very good projects. And if we want to have really good projects that do both climate and biodiversity, then it's going to cost more. The other thing that's a big challenge that's right now is trying to scale up fast. And so everybody's like, okay, we want to have all these projects across the globe. But frankly, we don't have the seed sources and the nurseries and the infrastructure. And so there's a big race right now. There was just a big report in the United States about this, like, where are we going to get all these seeds from to do this? And so it's definitely, sort of possible, but it's not going to be the cheapest carbon. And we really have to ramp up our infrastructure to be able to do this type of restoration if we're going to do it at the scale that's being proposed. Because a lot of the initiative, I mean, there's huge pledges, but the actual projects aren't that large, the majority of them.
Thank you so much, Karen. And look, just to finish off, I thought it would be fun to ask, you're a person that must have done a huge amount of field work in your time, and I'd imagine some fairly interesting places around the world. What's been your most memorable fieldwork experience?
It's really hard to pick one memorable fieldwork experience. One of the things you have to realize too about doing restoration is I tend to go to these really diverse rainforests, and then I'm out in the middle of the pasture land. And so, for instance, one time I was in Colombia and I spent like 5 days there, and I never actually saw the good forest because we were out in like silvopastoral, in grazing lands and things like that. And so a lot of the work, I mean, I love the work I do. When I do field work, I spend more time at the computer than I would like, but I'm often out like on steep slopes, tromping through really tall, like 3-meter tall grass and doing things like that. And so, I've definitely had my share of encounters with, more bugs than like snakes and things like that. But I think one of the things is, and sometimes it's doing field work is not nearly as sexy as people think. People think I'm going to Costa Rica in the summer when I'm not teaching and I'm going to be sitting on the beach, but no, I'm not. I'm on steep slope, counting plants, measuring trees and things like that. But I think that what makes it all rewarding is one, seeing the forest grow, but also two, the people I work with. And so I have had the fortune of working with really good students. I've had a lot of volunteers on my project and people coming out and making me realize that, I'm really fortunate to do the sort of job that I do. So I think that's sort of kind of my reflection on field work, and it's that it is really fun to be out there, but I do tend to end up by default in the more degraded areas of the landscape. So
I can certainly relate to that, Karen. Look, thank you so much for joining the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you, to hear your international context. It's just really good. So thank you for your time today.
Yeah, well, it's fun to talk to you, and I hope that there's some things that resonate with people who are working in New Zealand.
Thank you very much, Karen. Today we heard from Dr. Holl on her long-term experiments over effective ways to restore tropical forests and the balance between planting and regenerating tropical forests. Karen touched on the important social dimension, which is so often part of the picture with restoration. I was fascinated to hear how Karen described the common worldwide issues with tree planting schemes. Karen made the key points that we can't plant our way out of climate change. Instead, we need to reduce atmospheric carbon emissions, we need to protect existing forests, and we need to talk about tree growing and not simply tree planting. Karen highlighted that effective restoration involves having clear priorities and goals, engaging with local communities, and being in it for the long term. Thank you very much, Dr. Holl, for your rich contribution to the Nature Conversations podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, remember to bookmark it so that you receive notifications for future episodes. If you'd like to support the production of the podcast, you can do so via my Patreon account. There is a link in this episode's description. I aim to release new episodes every 3 weeks, and your support would help me achieve this. Thanks so much for listening, and catch you in the next episode where I'll be talking with Lydia Green, the founder and project director of Manta Watch New Zealand, when we'll be discussing all about manta rays in New Zealand and further afield. See you then.